New tonight, the feds are now investigating allegations that Minnesota tax dollars are being sent to an overseas terror group. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent took to X tonight, announcing his department is looking into whether the money is being diverted to Al-Shabaab, which is based in Somalia. Bessent says the alleged diversion happened, quote, under the feckless mismanagement of the Biden administration and Governor Tim Walz, end quote. The announcement comes after a weekend where Governor Walz and President Trump went back and forth on social media over fraud. The president first expressed his disdain in a Truth Social post a few days ago, where he called Minnesota a, quote, hub of money laundering activity. In the same post, Trump moved to revoke temporary protected status for Somalis living in Minnesota. And Walz took to the national media over the weekend to address the president's claims. When asked about the fraud, Walz came down on the president's rhetoric.
That is totally disconnected with demonizing an entire group of people who came here fleeing civil war and created a vibrant community that makes Minnesota and this country better. Do your job. Get the criminals out. Secure our border. But do it with dignity and respect to the American tradition of respecting immigrants and refugees as a beacon of hope.
Last week, Walz told the media his administration, as well as the state legislature, have recently taken steps to bolster the state's fraud response and detection.